Hello there, everyone. How you doing today? I hope you're all well. Today we're going to r/AskReddit, where Reddit asks medical professionals, when did you have to tell a patient I've seen it all before to comfort them, but really you had never seen something so bad or of that nature? And Reddit gave us the answers. If you enjoy, like and subscribe. Leave a comment with your thoughts or stories down below. Now let's get started. Probably too late to the party, but I had a lady come into the ER listed as multiple medical problems. This usually means diabetes and the issues stemming from it, or maybe bleeding issues from another disease, or maybe odd blood test results at a clinic. I hadn't seen the patient yet, but the doctor came to the nurse's station asking who had room 15. I jumped up and followed him into the room. I walked in and saw what I thought was a corpse. Then the patient's eyes swiveled over to look at me. She truly looked like one of the people you found at a concentration camp. I could see every bone, and her body was twisted in a décontracté position, with her jaw locked open. And then the smell hit me. Rotting flesh, death, and bodily fluids. I struggled to keep a neutral face and not gag. I tried to place a blood pressure cuff on her arm, and her skin just started flaking off in my hands. I gagged. The doctor started removing her clothes to examine her. Her feet were black to the ankles. Her hip bones were poking through her skin and were black. The skin around her ribs was worn away to oozing muscle fibers. Her calves were incredibly swollen, and the skin was splitting like ripped pants. I removed her depends, and there was feces coating her entire genital area. And then the doctor went to remove a large bandage on her lower back. Her entire sacrum was exposed, and the bones were black. The skin around it was a black liquefied mass. It smelled like nothing I've ever smelled. I can't even describe it. The doctor told her family I would clean up her ulcers and wounds in preparation for surgery. Well, that was a lie. No surgeon would operate on her. I had no idea how to clean dead bone tissue and liquefied skin. They don't cover this stuff in nursing school. When I went to clean her sacral area, all the liquefied skin separated and oozed all over the bed. I really struggled to keep my stuff together. Afterwards, I needed a moment in that supply closet to cry it out for a second. I had no idea the human body could break down so much without dying. I still think about that woman sometimes, and what led to her living like that. It still breaks my heart. In dental school, I had an emergency patient come in, complaining about sore gums. Upon examination, I found a massive calculus bridge. Google it for the pictures if you wanna, I'm not describing it. Behind her lower front teeth. She only had about 3 remaining lower teeth, but they were all connected with a whitish brown mineral deposit that was about the size of a golf ball. She had never had her teeth cleaned and was probably 55 or so. I basically performed an emergency cleaning. She could speak so much better afterwards. Of course, I had to play it off like it was normal, but in all my years of practice, I still haven't seen a case that bad again. Get your teeth cleaned, people. Even if you can't afford every 6 months, once a year, or every other year, is a hell of a lot better than never. I showed up to a house for a possible overdose. 3 firefighters and a police officer were on top of a man who was prone and naked from the waist down. They immediately told my partner and I to restrain the patient to the gurney, because the patient was combative. It turns out he took something thinking it was weed, but it turned out to be laced with something else, possibly PCP. During his trip, he attempted to cut his member off, but was not successful. As fate would have it, I knew the patient personally and tried to comfort him on the way to the hospital. During the ride, he became somewhat cognizant and was ashamed of himself. I tried to comfort him as I held his wee-wee in place, and I would be lying if I said I had seen a severed wee-wee before. I'm a nurse and I work in pediatric ER. A young woman brought her baby in to be seen for vomiting. I asked her to put her baby on the scale. While on the scale, I noticed a strong odor of bug spray, so I asked her about it. The mom said a roach crawled into her mouth, so I sprayed a little Raid in there. She said it so matter-of-factly it was like no big deal. Cue calls to the police, CPS, and a sitter for the child and the mom. When all was said and done, the baby was fine and turned over to her grandmother, so no worries there. I have no idea what happened to the mother. I don't believe she was intending to hurt the child. I just think she was butt-ass ignorant. I worked as a mental health tech to get through undergrad. A 15-year-old female in the adolescent ward claims to have swallowed a staple. But whatever. As I'm taking her down to X-ray, I tell her about the dime I swallowed when I was a kid. It happened. Well, turns out she underestimated the number of staples by about 100. Every printout given by the therapist had been about a swallowed staple. She had gotten staples from other kids. The X-ray of her abdomen looked like it was a weird stapley snow globe. And yet, somehow, she was back to trying to steal psych ward supplies a week later. Never did figure out if they removed them all. A little late to the party. Not the worst, but I had a patient once with a stomach bleed and a small bowel obstruction. We had to put the NG tube, a tube that goes in your nose and down to your stomach, to drain and decompress his stomach, which was pretty distended and hard. I'm inserting the tube, and as soon as it hits this guy's gag reflex, he projectile vomits and sprays very dark, half-digested blood all over himself, the bed, the wall, and all over the floor. Basically, it's a scene from The Exorcist. I had to dive out of the way, and somehow was unscathed. He couldn't stop for about 10 minutes, as we're trying to get this thing to where it needs to go. Finally, we finish placement, and immediately suctions out 3 liters of this black sludge. That is old, digested blood. The patient was mortified, and we had to play it off with, "Oh, no, it's fine. It's really common to vomit during the procedure. We'll just get some towels and clean you up." My coworker and I left the room and just stared at each other in shock. Not a medical professional, but we were patients. My daughter, who was 3 at the time, had to have a cavity filled. As we were leaving, the dentist told me to just watch my daughter because sometimes kids chew their gums because it's numb and it feels weird. So the drive home took 30 minutes, and I'd been talking to my daughter the entire time to keep her busy. I parked my car in my driveway, opened the passenger seat to get my daughter out, and her entire lower lip on the left side is gone. She had chewed it off down to her chin. She ended up in emergency surgery, but the surgeon kept telling us that it would be fine and he sees this stuff all the time. She ended up having multiple surgeries, and when she was finally healed, the surgeon told us that it was the worst injury like that he had ever seen. He wasn't sure how she would heal, but you can hardly tell it happened now. Mouth injuries heal pretty fast, I will admit. It really is weird how mouth injuries heal like that. Not a medical professional, but a story about my father. After a year of blood disease, his spleen had to be removed as it was swollen to a size that made breathing difficult. Apparently, the surgeon had a photo taken post-extraction where he is cradling my dad's 22-pound spleen. To top it off, one day into recovery, when doing one of those gentle push on the abdomen types of exams on him, my dad's sutures catastrophically failed, and he let loose a spray that coated the doctor, his nurse, and a good portion of the ceiling. Luckily for Dad, the hospital staff was on point that day and kept him alive despite his body's best effort. I heard all of this from the doctor while he was removing the line of staples that went from his crotch to his sternum some weeks later. Dad didn't like to share that story, apparently. Gee, I wonder why. Had a patient who needed a lower GI study to find and fix a bowel bleed. To get a study done, you need to poop clear mucus. 3 days we bowel prepped with heavy laxatives and enemas. He barely pooped anything. He puts on the call light at 6:45, 15 minutes before my shift ends. He calmly says, "I want to try and poop." He said it so casually I thought he was going to chew out another gas bubble and walk back. He stood from his bed, took one step before the floodgate bursts. 3 days and then some of the most rancid liquid stool I had ever encountered. It just wouldn't stop. He left a river of stool from the bed to the bathroom, coated the walls as he bent to park his butt on the toilet, and continued to dump out 7 people worth of stool. In my 9 years, I have never seen that much come out of a person, and he was not a large man, mind you. He was so embarrassed, but I just kept my face as solid as possible, grabbed half the linen closet and 3 packages of Cavi wipes, and sopped it up. Told him this happens all the time. Lots of stories, many already covered by others. I'll share this particular story with my legs crossed. A motorcyclist came in after someone turned without checking. He had gone over the hood, slid, and had somehow somersaulted, landing on his ass sitting up. He slid across the intersection, mostly on his butt, getting serious road rash. Luckily, he was only a block from the hospital and an ambulance. They pack him up and bring him to the ER. We end up cutting off his chaps and jeans and begin the cleanup of gravel and sand embedded in his thighs and butt, when all of a sudden, his testicles fall out of his scrotum. He had basically sandpapered a hole in his scrotum while skidding on his butt. The attending nurse pauses, grabs the saline, irrigates the scrotum and nuts, fondles them, and puts them back into place while humming. I handed him some gauze to pack the wound and smiled at the patient, who was under a local. Then I went on break, went fetal, and drived. How? It's both an ow and a how, and oh my god, the ow goes double. Oh! Pain! Worked in a heart procedure lab that helped try and get rid of bad heart rhythms. A prisoner came in for a last-ditch effort to help his failing heart. He had developed a condition called ventricular tachycardia. Setting up the patient and looking at his heart rhythm, it looked pretty bad. Before we got started and grabbed my arm and said, "I'm scared. Is it going to be okay? We have very talented physicians here, sir, and they do this all the time." The condition was set off during the procedure and deteriorated into fibrillation. We were able to resuscitate him, but he never woke back up. Comfort your patients, folks. As a new nurse, I worked on a new nephrology unit, which meant that we dealt with mostly patients who had kidney failure and needed hemodialysis 3 times a week to clean their blood. A patient was admitted through the emergency room and told me he hadn't begun the dialysis in 4 weeks. He had HIV, kidney failure, he had lost custody of his kids after a messy divorce, and had no will to live. He planned to just stay in his home until he died. He probably wasn't far from it, but a neighbor who hadn't seen him for a few weeks peeked in the window and saw him sitting, unresponsive on the couch. They called 911 and was brought to my hospital. 3 weeks is an insanely long time to go without dialysis. Dialysis removes toxins and excess fluid from your blood. Missing a session can leave you feeling sick and swollen. Missing 12 sessions can kill you. This guy was so swollen. I've never seen a person who was so full of fluid. He looked like that girl from Willy Wonka that turned into a blueberry. His feet and ankles were particularly massive. I wasn't sure that he would live. Miraculously, after several dialysis sessions, he'd fully deflated. However, he was left with lots of loose skin afterwards, which had the fragile texture of an old balloon. One night, he called me to his room and said, "I think my foot is bleeding." And he was right. He'd slid down the bottom of his bed and used his legs to push himself back up towards the top. And in doing so, the fragile skin on the bottoms of his feet had been totally sheared away, leaving only tissue and bone and oh so much blood. I had no idea what to do, so I just called the code blue. The patient wasn't dead or dying, but no part of nursing school or practice had prepared me for an HIV patient who had just ripped the soles of his feet and was currently laying on a 3 feet wide, rapidly expanding puddle of blood. I just needed to get a whole bunch of people to the room as quickly as possible. I threw on a waterproof gown and some gloves and held pressure on the bottom of his feet with a towel until help arrived. They didn't know what to do either. We called in the general surgeon, who seemed to think we might be exaggerating the extent of the damage and blood loss. He told us he'd be there in half an hour, and to just hold pressure until it stopped bleeding. We soaked towel after towel until finally the surgeon shows up. He breezes into the room, moves my towel, and says, "Humph." Then he reaches towards the patient's foot and pulls off a huge softball-sized blood clot. In that moment, time stopped. He held out his hand, holding the huge clot, and I, without really thinking about what I was doing, held my hand out too. He plopped the clot right into my outstretched hand. In the next moment, several things happened at once. I realized I was holding a big coagulated mess of blood. I started dry heaving. I dropped on the floor and it splattered. The surgeon exclaims, "Oh, Jesus, frick!" Not in response to my gags or the fact he was splattered by the clot I dropped, but because the patient's foot is now profusely bleeding again. He darts off and tells us to get the patient down to OR immediately. We need him down there, and on the way back realized that he left a trail of blood down the hallways into the elevator and to the operating theater. I saw the patient during my next shift and jokes, "I thought you were going to pass out when the doctor handed you that mess." To which I replied, "Sir, I was positive you were about to bleed to death." Oh boy. Anyway, that's the end of today's video. I hope you all enjoyed. Remember to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts and stories below. I will see you all next time.